Okay, hi everyone. My name is Prilia and I'm from Indonesian Center for Environmental Law. Right now, I'm going to be interviewing Edmund. He is the representative of Malaysia of the ICHR and he's also currently the chair of ICHR this year. And we're going to be interviewing him on the Asian Declaration on Environmental Rights, and pretty much we're going to talk about the challenges, potentials, and also next steps of the implementation of the declaration itself. So to start off with, maybe you can tell me more about the current development of the declaration.
So AICHR has been developing this declaration because we realize that there's a real problem with the climate. So climate change and a lot of the other planetary crises, we see that there's a need to marry the environmental world, the environmental experts, the environmental techniques that we talk about, such as targets to preserve biodiversity and the other matters under the Paris Agreement. There's a whole world out there. We want to marry that world with the human rights world. So the human rights world have a lot of principles where through the preservation of the environment, you still need to respect and protect. And so the declaration has aspirations to ensure that the procedural, governance, accountability, and human rights standards are also taken into account when we try and meet the Paris Agreement targets. We are looking at issues of freedom of information, public participation, protection of indigenous people, masyarakat adat, protection of environmental human rights defenders, looking at due diligence, and looking at access to justice and remedies. So these pillars come a lot from the environmental human rights side. And we have the Human Rights Council. We also have the UN GA resolution on recognizing these rights. But in ASEAN, to let it trickle down, we have been taking efforts to try and marry these two within the ASEAN landscape, the architecture, because ASEAN works in such a way that the AICHR looks at human rights, and then there's another body called the ASEAN Senior Officials Meeting on Environment that looks at environment. So we want to try and marry the work of ASEAN, the environment officials, and AICHR human rights together in a cohesive way that is acceptable to ASEAN and where it is able to be implemented in a comprehensive manner. So the declaration should include these principles. The working group of AICHR has been working on it for 2 years now. And during Malaysia's chairmanship, we have now come to some sort of an agreement that there is one version of the draft, but countries need to go back and do their local consultations. So Indonesia, you will have your local consultations with your government and with your AICHR representative. Malaysia will have our own, Thailand, Vietnam. We will have our own local consultations. We have 1 month to come back with input and feedback. It comes back to the AICHR. The AICHR then will decide which inputs to incorporate, which inputs to reject, or which inputs we can compromise on. So that is the second stage of negotiations. And we intend to do that in April. So the last meeting we had in Langkawi in February, very recently, we managed to come up to an agreement that there's one draft to be able to use for local consultation. In April, we will look at the inputs, and then we will have a consultation with the ASEAN senior officials on the environment as well. We will invite them to Malaysia and we will have a meeting, and we want to see their views because their views are very important. It's no use having a declaration which has nice sounding themes and words, but when it comes to implementation, it cannot be done. So ASEAN has to implement this declaration. And that's why this declaration is important not only for the ASEAN officials, but also for the people of ASEAN. ASEAN works in a very different way from the EU, from the countries in the north, even from Africa and South America. ASEAN works in a way where you need to have some sort of a broad consensus first through some sort of declaration which is non-binding, and then we move on to have a plan of action. So if you ask me what is the current status of the draft documenting this now, I'm saying that we will want the countries to come back after their local consultations. So if your organization or any organization that's interested in the issue should be advocating with the government of Indonesia, the same similarly with other NGOs around the region should be advocating with their own governments to include things that are important to all of you.
Okay. Okay, I think it's really interesting that you do not only mention about like the substantive elements, but you also mentioned about like the procedural elements, how you engage with more stakeholders, and so on and so forth. How do you see your chairmanship in like engaging more with CSOs? I think you mentioned about like how right now the the negotiation is going on, right? But is it something that you endorse to other countries as well?
Yeah.
Okay.
So Malaysia's chairmanship has the theme of inclusivity and sustainability.
Okay.
In Malaysia, speaking for my own country, we have been very open with NGOs and CSOs, and we have always received their feedback. We don't always, and the government doesn't always accept everybody's feedback. We hear and then we have consultations. We have very strong criticisms, and again we have to sit down with the government officials and CSOs to then try and work out something. So in Malaysia, I think there is no issue. With other countries, there are different channels of consultation and different means and ways of consultation. But generally, for a declaration and a project of this sort, where it's so big, we should have more consultations with interested groups. It can be CSOs, it can be NGOs, it can be businesses, it can be civil society. Interestingly, the declaration also looks at some sort of responsibility for businesses and non-state actors, because they control a large part of the economy and they can control a lot of things that promotes environmental rights, and that's why we also need to talk about them, not just talk about the state. In AICHR, we have CSOs with consultative status, and through the 2 years of developing this draft, the working group has had a lot of CSOs participating. That's why you have a draft that's very comprehensive that needed to be negotiated. So we can already see that from the start of this process, we have CSO participation from all segments of society, from the youth, from the indigenous, and from environmental groups. Now it's time for local consultation. Again, how the consultation happens based on ASEAN's principle of neutrality, we will have to leave it to the country to decide how they want to do it.
And I think you also mentioned about like the inclusion for like vulnerable groups, I think, and also like other part such as local communities as well, and indigenous people. How do you plan on like strengthening those aspects as well?
So the declaration, I think across ASEAN we are very committed and we accept the language that a lot of the human rights initiatives must protect groups in vulnerable, groups in marginalized situations. So there are a lot of groups affected by disaster, ethnic communities, indigenous people, people living in the rural areas, women, children, persons with disabilities, elderly. A lot of these groups are already recognized in ASEAN. And I am confident that the declaration will provide special protection for these groups, among other groups. How we term these groups, define these groups, is something to be negotiated about. But definitely what you have mentioned, which is very important, is not forgotten. It is at the utmost of our minds in the declaration.
Okay, thank you. And you also mentioned about business sectors. Is it also something that you prioritize in the declaration?
Yes, so the declaration, as with all human rights treaties, would normally have obligations on the state. But I think in this situation, looking at the guiding principles of business and human rights, there are also non-state obligations that are coming in. So what we have done in the declaration, as you see in your local consultations, is that there are state obligations, and then it also says the state should encourage private businesses to respect, protect environmental rights and remedy the negative impacts on the environment.
I see. Okay. And then you also mentioned about like how then this declaration can be trickled down into like regional implementation plan, something that's more like in national level as well. How do you see it?
So ASEAN works in this way. ASEAN will have a non-binding declaration, and then at the sort of the last few lines of the declaration, the ASEAN leaders will task a certain body. In this case, we are proposing AICHR. For AICHR, with ASEAN, the environmental experts in ASEAN, to develop what we call a regional plan of action. The regional plan of action is to operationalize the declaration. So, for example, if the declaration talks about public participation, how does the regional plan of action aims to promote and protect public participation, both at the regional level and the national level? Once we have the regional plan of action, then AICHR with member states of 10 and the representatives will then come together to implement the plan of action. And in the implementation of the plan of action, there will be local and national involvement of agencies. So that's how ASEAN sort of develops its framework, a regional framework for cooperation on human rights, and then it trickles down in the sense that it will encourage national states, ASEAN member states, to implement that plan of action.
I see.
So this is the second stage. Once we adopt the declaration,
Okay.
we need to negotiate again the plan of action. And that's where, again, we would need to have many consultations. How we do it in the modality, we will have to discuss that further. But that's the second stage of the
After the
implementation of the environmental rights.
Okay, thank you. So can you give me like a closing statement about like this whole process of Asian Declaration? Maybe your hope, your expectations.
So at AICHR, I've come back for the second time. The first time was 2016 for 3 years. This is a very, very good experiment. The AICHR has not really developed any declaration apart from the ASEAN Human Rights Declaration. So if you ask me what my expectations and hopes are, it is that we can develop a forward-looking, progressive environmental rights declaration that protects both present and future generations that we can use for the next 20 years to 2045, where we are going to adopt a vision for 2045, and that we will be able to continue to protect the environment and guard against all the different threats we have to the environment in a way that's holistic and that includes human rights principles. That is my hope.
Okay, everyone. Thank you for listening. I think that's the end of our interview. Thank you so much, Edmund, for the interview. Hopefully, it's going to be the start of the strengthening process of the fulfillment toward the environmental rights in ASEAN. And hopefully, this declaration is a baby step and also a step forward for the human the coalition and between human rights and also environmental rights in ASEAN. So thank you,
Thank you
everyone.
very much.